Income inequality is an issue that fascinates me for different reasons, I think, than it fascinates or enraptures the minds of critics of how the American economy is going. Yes, it is true. We're having more concentrated wealth at the top 10% or 1% or 0.1% of the earners control 14% of the money. I should say the wealthiest control 14% of the wealth. Okay, but what should the number be? Whenever we talk about income inequality, one question I always have is who should be losing money such that the ability for one group to raise up in the decile of income distribution is offset by someone who has to leave that decile. That's the thing about climbing the ladder of income distribution. In order for you to get to the top 10%, someone's got to be jettisoned out of it. These are but some of the questions touched upon a really interesting look at the politics of inequality, not so much the economics, but how much our understanding of what the people, the American people, really think about inequality maps onto what our politics are and what the people actually tell the politicians. Andrew J. Taylor is a professor at North Carolina State University, and he is out with a new book called A Tolerance for Inequality, American Public Opinion and Economic Policy. Professor Taylor, welcome to The Gist.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
So this book is a lot of things, and it's a valuable contribution to, I think, I don't know, you tell me, the conventional wisdom or what's taken as the conventional wisdom about the disconnect between the American people's clamoring for more income equality and the message that they're giving their elected officials and the policies that the elected officials are enacting. So that is question one. Was this book motivated by you looking at the political science and saying people are just assuming a lot of things that no one's really studied?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So I think this is generally what a lot of politicians, particularly Democrats and increasingly some Republicans as well, particularly in the era of Trump, and political scientists believe, and that is that the political system is in some way rigged in terms of economic outcomes in favor of the wealthier. You gave a variety of different plausible definitions of the wealthiest or the wealthier segments of American society, but however defined, they have an advantage in the American political system, and that is as a result of the fact that they vote more, they're more politically active, they are more energetic in the political system, they have greater knowledge of politics. They give, of course, more money, and more of them populate positions of political power, whether that be at the federal level in Congress or in the presidential administration, whether that be at the state level. As a result of all of these things, they are able to influence economic policy, move it to the right, and make it more favorable to their own self-interest, and therefore make them increasingly wealthy.
Right. So a couple of things that you don't necessarily dispute, or you tell me, that if we measure it fairly, income inequality is growing. Is that something that you generally concede?
Yes, there are a couple of caveats to that. I mean, there's some work that suggests that a lot of those measures don't count government transfers, so they don't count welfare payments and other kinds of transfers from government that would mitigate the inequality a little bit if you counted those. Another thing is, and I talk about this in the book, the measure that we tend to use with regards to income inequality in the United States is called a Gini coefficient, and this measures the dispersion in a particular community of individuals based upon their income. The thing is, though, that tends to exaggerate inequality at lower levels. So you might have, and I look at congressional districts, for example, you might have a district, let's say in Mississippi around Jackson, where there is a significant amount of inequality according to the Gini coefficient. And it's similar to one that's, say, in the New York or San Francisco area. But that's largely
I've been to all three places, and let me tell you, when I'm in and around Jackson, I'm not feeling the have and the have-nots like I am here in New York or when I go to the Bay Area.
Exactly. Even though the haves may have the same multiples of income of the have-nots in Jackson as they do in New York, it's largely because the poor are very poor. And the wealthy are pretty wealthy rather than the wealthy are very wealthy. And there's a sort of floor under a lot of the particularly least well-off people in that congressional district.
Right, because if I raise someone's income from 1,000 to 2,000, I've doubled their income, and I've really skewed the ratio of the 2,000 heir to the rich guy. But I haven't really, in practical terms, done anything in terms of have and have-nots and real inequality.
Exactly. But with those things in mind, the original question is largely true. If you do look at a same indicator of wealth in the concentration of wealth in the United States, in the post-war period, since the 1980s, it has grown, and it is unusually high compared to peer advanced industrialized democracies.
Another thing that I do take from reading your book that you agree with is that Republicans, especially in the last 40 years or so, they generally do favor and vote for policies that, well, I want to be fair, you tell me, that do exacerbate inequality as we measure it?
Well, no one really votes for inequality.
That's right. They vote for the policies.
They vote for policies, and then we make then economists and political scientists and others critique those policies and try to ascertain whether they contribute to inequality or not. But if you do accept that, for example, across-the-board tax cuts and efforts to decrease government spending in the domestic policy area leads to greater inequality, then yes, obviously people with right-of-center politics generally vote Republican, and Republicans generally embrace those policies.
Right. Then there are regulations which are a little more skewed, especially with the will of the voters. But let's get to that. A main point demonstrated many ways in charts and in surveys is that stipulating everything we said, one of the hallmarks of the argument about Democratic politicians make is that the will of the people isn't being represented given these unequal outcomes. But you show over and over again that if you look at the policies that are voted on, it is not true that the will of the people has been disregarded. And especially on some economic policies, like, say, welfare, the American public is quite conservative. Yes.
So in the first couple of substantive chapters, I look at sort of the development of economic policy outcomes from basically the post-World War II period right up to the present, and then match them up against measures of public opinion. And in the aggregate level, there really isn't much of a disconnect. And in fact, when there are times of disconnect, so for example, in the second half of the 1970s, prior to the Reagan Revolution in 1980, when they are out of step, it is actually that policy is often to the left of public opinion rather than the other way around. But generally, it does a pretty good job. Policy matches up fairly well against aggregate measures of public opinion. The same goes for individual policies, individual economic policies as well. You mentioned social welfare policy, but I also look at healthcare policy. I look at environmental policy, energy policy, housing policy, labor policy in the post-World War II period. And for the most part, there are obviously exceptions. There is a pretty good correlation between our measures of American public opinion and our measures of federal economic policy output.
So maybe it's the case that the people are getting the policies they want, but are they getting the outcomes they want?
Well, that's a different question, right? That is, policy is an instrument, as you said. And what we try to do with policies is get the desirable outcomes that we want. And sometimes policy does that and sometimes policy doesn't. However, I do show, so for example, in the second substantive chapter, in chapter 3, that regardless of Americans' personal financial circumstances, they don't really care too much about this sort of abstraction called equality or inequality. They're much more interested in their own personal circumstances, their family circumstances, and whether those are in an upward trajectory or they are improving as opposed to worsening.
Yeah.
Rather than, am I or is the country or is my state more equal than it was last year or 5 years ago?
Well, I wouldn't think they'd care, but I would think that they'd want to prosper. And maybe it's too difficult to explain to them or to get their minds around an abstraction. But if the abstraction does turn out to be an excellent explanation for why they're not prospering, then maybe we could provide the linkage between inequality affecting their lives. I don't know if that's fair or not.
Yeah, plausibly. But again, even if they are thinking about that, I think even the instruments that they look at to alleviate inequality or improve their own personal circumstances are often different from the ones that we think that they would be looking at. So, a lot of political science literature says, because of inequality, Americans are increasingly, particularly those further down the income or wealth ladder, increasingly moving back towards redistribution and redistributive policies to rectify the situation. We talked about perhaps social welfare, or maybe we're seeing a lot in the news, of course, in the last few years about plans for a wealth tax that is considered to sort of be punitive, but also to be able to equalize incomes better than they currently are. But particularly people of lower incomes tend to feel that there are different ways that we can do that. So they're very interested in, for example, the government providing public goods, that government should be spending money on schools, that government should be spending money on healthcare, not necessarily in a redistributive manner, but to provide sort of basic services for everybody, regardless of their circumstances. They also believe greatly in tax cuts rather than spending increases. And of course, they can benefit from those depending upon how the tax cut is, what kind of tax cut it is, as much as they can to direct transfer payments to themselves. So they have a sort of very interesting, and the they here is looking at people of what I call less affluent or lower income people, have some sort of interesting understanding of what economic policies that they want, and they have an interesting understanding that's different, I think, from what political science thinks, of what kind of economic situation they want to find themselves in and what they think the country should be in.
Isn't it true that people think about this straightforwardly? I'm not going to say simplistically. So if you give them a scheme by which they can qualify for something that earns them something that can be spent on something that will never be as popular as we're going to open a free clinic and you can go and get health care, just direct point of service interventions.
Well, I think probably, and also especially if it's not means tested.
Yes, people hate that generally, don't they?
Yes, like the public school system is a good example, right? I mean, everybody can send their kids to public school regardless of their means, and it's not seen as a kind of handout,
right?
Or it's not seen as a act of charity or benevolence by the state. It's seen as an investment in one's capacity to be a productive citizen. And those are the kinds of policies. You see this, for example, a lot, for example, with regards to social welfare policy. So there's a bit in the book about that shows how consistently and at high levels Americans have supported this idea of welfare for work, that in order to be able to, and this was at the heart of the 1996 welfare overhaul legislation, if you remember, passed in the Clinton years, that if you are going to get welfare, then you have to work or demonstrate that you're looking for work or be in
something
job
like,
training.
If I'm recalling the poll right, 89% of people thought that welfare benefits should end after 2 years.
Yes, something along those lines. Those are the kinds of public policies that people of lesser means, Democrats, Republicans, but people at the lower income levels, those are the kinds of policies that they embrace. Those are the kinds of policies that, of course, the American federal government has largely supported over the last 40 to 50 years.
Another interesting avenue of inquiry in the book is the question of whether lower income, less educated, blue collar Americans care, I'll quote from you, care to receive representation from legislators more like themselves or the current fat cats in Washington. What'd you find there?
Yeah, so there's some research in political science that sort of suggests, look, if only we could change the sort of socioeconomic composition of members of Congress, we'd have more blue collar members of Congress, more sort of, AOCs and more people with those kinds of modest backgrounds, then public policy would change because they'd be more sympathetic or empathetic to the less well-off. They understand what it's like to try to make ends meet, and the policy outcomes would reflect the interests of that segment of our population more. But there's just no evidence to that effect. If you, for example, match up, if you look at the net worth, the education, the occupations of members of Congress over the last 50 years, they don't match up at all with districts, which sort of suggests, given, for example, that we argue that when black districts with large numbers of black Americans elect black representatives, that's a function of them expressing a desire to have someone like themselves represent themselves. Well, blue-collar districts don't elect blue-collar members. Blue-collar members often come from white-collar districts and vice versa. And I've also was able to get some data now. We have data that about the net worth, not just of members of the House of Representatives, but the candidates who run against them. And so you can do some surveys here and look at who votes for the wealthier candidate and who votes for the less wealthy candidate.
When people have the opportunity in a democracy to vote in the less wealthy candidate, the answer is...
And they don't. They don't. They don't care. And
now, the counter argument would be like, well, the wealthier candidate can fund campaigns, but even norming for that, you find they don't.
Yes. Yeah. So there's no indication that the less well-off, the less affluent, blue-collar Americans want more than their more affluent compatriots a blue-collar Congress.
What policy preferences have blue-collar voters consistently shown to have that are different from richer voters?
Well, increasingly, interestingly enough, they are more moderate. So one of the things that the book sort of talks about, and this is sort of for something I want to explore going forward, is the tremendous polarization at higher income levels, at white-collar levels, at higher levels of education. So if you take, for example, tax policy preferences or social welfare policy preferences, at the high end, Democrats are pretty left and Republicans are pretty right. And we understand what those positions are in social welfare and tax policy. But as you go down the income level or the education level, the two lines meet just about. And Democrats and Republicans at the lower levels basically agree on policies that are somewhere between the highly educated, affluent Republicans and the highly educated, affluent Democrats.
Right. So this is interesting because the Democrats, the Democratic Party, will make a fat cat in Washington type case that the reason that our national policies are skewed towards the rich is something like because rich people are making the policies, or especially that poorer people like you, my constituents, or people who might vote for me, are not represented. That's not what's going on. That's fine rhetoric. The real difference you're finding is that fat cat Democrats, or the wealthy, educated, upper-class Democrats, very much disagree with their brethren on the right, the people of the same socioeconomic class. That's the difference. It's not really at all about the drawing our representatives from the pool of blue-collar workers or representing the policy preferences of the blue-collar workers. They actually disagree with Democrats who are white-collar.
Yes. And in fact, I just mentioned social welfare and tax policies. There's a number of other policies where I show that, Mike, in the book. So there's some interesting data that show if you take surveys, people are asked to trade off between environmental protection and jobs. And what you find is that the only people who really want environmental protection are wealthy Democrats. So blue collar and minority, African American, for example, Democrats and Republicans want jobs, and affluent, well-educated Democrats want the environment. And there are a number of these kinds of policy issues where you see the differences.
It doesn't mean the wealthier Democrats are wrong. It just means that the argument that this is undemocratic is not the accurate description of what's going on. In fact, over and over again, I come to, maybe because I'm more Democrat than Republican and just going by income distribution, highest decile probably, these are so often my policy preferences, not always, but so often. And I can't say it's because what the people want. What I can say is because I think it's what the people should want, or be something like because it's what I think is right, which is probably a loser if I were running for office and were campaigning on it, but it's also the truth.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's not demonstrative of a breakdown in American democracy, which is sort of a broad theme of the book, that just because it's something that you want for others, or you think it's something that they should want if they were being rational, doesn't mean it's something that they are telling you that they want. And elected officials can only respond to the requests that are made of them by the voters.
Yeah. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, that it's not a breakdown in democracy, that we're still getting these policies that many, many, many of them, at least we both agree, exacerbate income inequality? We mostly agree that broadening income inequality is a problem. What should we think of that normatively?
Yeah, I mean, I do, from a normative perspective, I do think that people, including myself, are starting to get uncomfortable. One of the things one reason people do get more uncomfortable with it is not so much the inequality in itself, but the fact that we don't have the kind of social mobility that as a society we had, let's say, up until the 1990s.
It was a hallmark of America, right? We've always had more inequality than France, but we also had a greater elevator to the top.
Yeah, and if you look at a lot of the research, that it does show that sort of intergenerational change. So, if you're a son or daughter of wealthy people, wealthy parents, you're much more likely to stay at the top now than you were in the past, and vice versa. If you were son or daughter of poor parents, it's much harder to climb the ladder now than it used to be in the past. And I think for most Americans, this is my opinion, I think for most Americans, they're more concerned about that than they are that we just have this sort of basic inequality.
Right. Why should we care if there are some rich guys or more rich guys or a lot of rich guys? We can make the argument. It makes certain goods harder to get. But in general, this is where most Americans are. I don't know. Elon Musk becoming a trillionaire, not thrilled with it, but Bill Gates.
A lot of people would aspire to it. I mean, they think it can be them, which keeps them thinking and having a stake in the system. But they don't mind if they see trillionaires. A lot of people don't care, but what they do care is if I'm kind of disqualified from becoming a trillionaire, then that is not fair. It's not the fact that we have trillionaires.
Are there any interesting areas where it's been shown that arguments that have been used to gain some support for a policy that would exacerbate inequality at the time resonated, but then in retrospect didn't, really fell apart when the policy was enacted? I'm thinking things like the wealth tax. I'm thinking, you go through 4 major tax proposals. Does that happen, or does the opposite happen?
That the support falls apart afterwards?
Yeah, I'm thinking at the time. Well, the opposite happened with the Trump tax cuts. They actually, of his first term, they got more popular as time went on. But what about other other policies that were passed over the objections of the sort of people who tell you that income inequality is really bad for us. And then in time, the public came to agree with those warnings.
I think what happens is that things become normalized and people recalibrate their understanding of the status quo. And a lot of their support for these policies is a function of whether the economy and they themselves are doing well or not, rather than any kind of objective analysis of the policy's performance. So, this is a lot of the thinking about the Big Beautiful Bill Act, that it was everybody's arguing, and this would be evidence against my general thesis in the book, that it was very unpopular, even though Trump and the Republicans were able to get it through. But I think the real sort of test of it is, what will it do as an instrument that is able to affect the broader economy? And if it does mean that we have a recession or a large amount of problems, perhaps as a result of the reduced spending on Medicaid, maybe because the way the tax part of the bill is set up, that we have revenue problems or we have broader macroeconomic problems, then people will see it as a failure. One of the things I do in the book is to look at public opinion on important pieces of legislation, as you just mentioned. And what tends to happen is that people are initially a little circumspect and suspicious, because they think they're the ones who are going to get ripped off as individuals. That this is going to be good for other people, but bad for me.
No matter the bill, they always say, I think some large percentage of people always say, I think my taxes are going to rise, even with bills that have no provision for raising taxes on anyone, like the first Trump tax cuts.
Yeah, so they're worried about that. But when they sort of engage with the argument, if legislation is moving towards passage, it's because they tend to support it. And if it's a sort of touch and go thing, the leadership, the political leadership in Washington and across the country, the party in power that really wants it to happen, works very, very hard to push it over the finish line. If it's not going anywhere, because the public can't be moved on it, then it's stopped in its tracks.
So looking back at I don't know if you want to take the post-war period or last 40 years, but you don't really see evidence of a designed plutocracy going on?
Not a designed one, no. Not a designed one. I mean, there are political, social, cultural, economic forces that have created a different kind of economy. And we've talked about that it is a little bit more, or maybe quite, depending on the measure, quite a lot more unequal than, let's say, that this economy was in 1980. But perhaps even more problematically, it's more static. There's not as much social mobility. And of course, a lot of that has to do with things that policymakers can't really do much about, which globalization, emergence of new technologies, the different ways that we work, all of these kinds of forces that have created these kinds of outcomes. And policymakers are really just trying as much as they possibly can to sort of, herd these sheep or affect these huge forces at the margins.
Yeah. I guess to steelman a critic, they would say, well, you're pointing out that there is this inequality. There's something akin to a plutocracy emerging, a greater plutocracy. There's one party that's consistently passing and cheering on the legislation and regulations that enable or exacerbate that. And also, they seem pretty fine with it. So without getting into motivations or if anyone's twirling their mustaches, isn't that a more or less fair description of what's going on? And what's the countervailing argument? Is it just, but the people generally want it?
Well, I guess to a certain extent in the book, that is the countervailing argument, right? I mean, if, that's what democracies are, good democracies give the people what they want at the end of the day. But if you do have a problem with the outcomes, and I mean, explicit in your question, Mike, is that you have problems with them, and I think a lot of people do, including myself sometimes.
I'm trying to be fair, but not to over-interpret them, but it seems like a fair reaction to what's going on.
So what do we do? What do we do, even if the public doesn't want to rescue itself from these kinds of things? Again, policymakers are a little bit beholden to broader forces, but I think essentially what lower-income Americans say they want, which is maybe rather than whole-scale redistribution, greater investment in public goods that bring off dividends, such as education, healthcare, maybe scientific research, perhaps. We want lower taxes, but a sort of more progressive tax structure. Perhaps we want intelligent regulation in areas where it was required, and allow more free market forces in areas where it isn't. That's a sort of pragmatic approach, but it's far from socialism, my sense is it might change some of those kinds of negative outcomes that you mentioned in the question.
A Tolerance for Inequality is the name of the new book. Andrew J. Taylor, North Carolina State professor of political science, is the author. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike.